Imagine the plague tearing through Europe, corpses stacked in streets, families vanishing overnight. Now imagine that terror weaponized. In 1348 and 1349, as the Black Death raged, entire towns along the Rhine turned their rage not on the disease, but on their neighbors. Jews were accused of poisoning wells, tortured until they confessed, then burned alive in pyres that lit the night sky. In Strasbourg, thousands were slaughtered before the plague even arrived. Councils kept neat minutes, debts were erased, and massacres became civic policy. This isn't just plague, it's panic transformed into genocide. And the horror was only beginning. The Black Death wasn't just a disease, it was the apocalypse wearing a rat's cloak. Between 1347 and 1351, Europe lost somewhere between a third and half its entire population. Entire villages vanished. Priests died faster than they could bury their parishioners. Cities reeked of rot, with carts piled high, bells tolling endlessly, and plague pits swallowing thousands at once. Imagine New York or London today, losing half its population in just 2 years. You'd think the world had ended. But the worst part? Nobody knew why. Germ theory didn't exist. People clawed for explanations. Sin, stars, bad air, divine punishment. And in that chaos, suspicion became lethal. Rumors began whispering through alleys and marketplaces. Someone must be causing this. Someone must be poisoning the water. And in medieval Europe, when you said poison, people looked to the most vulnerable scapegoats they already distrusted. By the winter of 1348, eyes turned toward Jewish communities. For centuries, Jews had been forced into separate quarters, barred from trades, and loaded with stereotypes. Now, as people collapsed in the streets, those old hatreds ignited. What if the Jews were behind it all? What if they had poisoned the wells? In a world where ignorance spread faster than fleas, it seemed plausible to desperate minds. Soon, whispers would become accusations. Accusations would become torture, and torture would become fire. But if you think this was random hysteria, wait until you see how city councils actually planned the massacres. Picture this. A peasant in the Rhine Valley lifts a bucket of water from a well, takes a sip, and collapses. His neighbors don't blame fleas. They don't blame plague. They blame a Jew they saw walking past the well last week. That's how the well poisoning conspiracy began. One cough, one corpse, one rumor at a time. By late 1348, the hysteria spread like wildfire. In Savoy, confessions were wrung from Jewish men under torture. Yes, they screamed through broken teeth. We put poison in the wells. Never mind that torture produces whatever story the torturer wants to hear. Never mind that Jews were dying of plague just like Christians. The narrative had already set. Jews were agents of the devil, working to destroy Christendom with hidden powders. Chillingly, we still have documents. In Chillon Castle on Lake Geneva, interrogators wrote down a confession detailing how Jews supposedly received poison from rabbis and scattered it into streams. It was a medieval version of a conspiracy meme, fabricated, shared, believed, and deadly. And once words are written in ink, panic becomes policy. Councils began arresting Jews en masse, not because they had proof, but because fear demanded scapegoats. It was easier to burn a neighbor than admit you didn't understand disease. But here's the kicker. These weren't spontaneous riots. In many towns, the massacres were organized, scheduled, and even approved by Christian city councils. Fear became bureaucracy, and bureaucracy would soon turn into industrial slaughter. Here's the twisted irony. Strasbourg's Jews were massacred before the Black Death even touched the city. February 14th, 1349, Valentine's Day. Instead of roses and love letters, Strasbourg staged a pogrom that turned the city square into an inferno. The city council had convened days earlier, and the debate was cold, bureaucratic, terrifying. Should they protect their Jewish community, long established, wealthy, vital to the city's trade, or should they give in to the growing mob screaming for blood? The answer came down to politics. Local nobles were drowning in debt to Jewish lenders. What better way to erase the ledgers than to erase the people holding them? The council voted. The Jews would die. And so, on that icy February morning, Strasbourg's 2,000 Jews were herded into the city square. Witnesses later wrote that wooden platforms were prepared, bonfires built high. Men, women, and children were tied together, shoved into the flames. Some sources say around 1,000 were burned alive that day, while the rest were banished, their property seized by the city. The plague hadn't even arrived. This wasn't about survival. It was about money, fear, and hate dressed up as divine justice. Think about that. A city murdered thousands not because they were dying, but because they were afraid of dying. It was a preemptive genocide, the logic of panic weaponized. And if Strasbourg could do it, others would follow. Next came the Rhine River towns, where the killings spread like the plague itself. Once Strasbourg lit the match, the Rhine burned with human bodies. Town after town, from Mainz to Worms, from Cologne to Speyer, unleashed their own brutal purges. It was like a medieval domino effect of terror. One massacre justified the next. If Strasbourg did it, why shouldn't we? Became the grim logic. In Mainz, one of Europe's largest Jewish communities, the violence was apocalyptic. Chroniclers say the Jews fought back, barricading themselves in their quarter with makeshift weapons. But what chance did they have against thousands of armed townsfolk? When the walls fell, the slaughter was so frenzied that entire families killed themselves rather than face the mobs. Parents reportedly slit their children's throats, believing a quick death was kinder than what awaited. Imagine that desperation. Imagine choosing to murder your own child because you know your neighbors will do something worse. In Worms, the Jews were rounded up and burned en masse, their screams rising above the bells that tolled as if it were a holiday. In Cologne, survivors were expelled, their property seized, synagogues desecrated. Across the Rhine, it became a cycle. Accusation, arrest, torture, execution, fire. And here's the cruel twist. Plague often followed right after. The massacres solved nothing. Fleas and rats didn't care about pogroms. The same towns that killed their Jews still saw bodies pile up in the streets weeks later. But that didn't stop anyone. Once fear became ritual, mass murder felt like medicine. And yet, not every city followed the script. Some tried to resist the panic and paid dearly for it. Not every city gave in. In fact, some leaders actually tried to protect their Jewish communities. But in 1349, compassion was political suicide. Take Basel, Switzerland. When the first rumors of well poisoning spread, the city's councillors wavered. Some argued it was nonsense. After all, Jews were dying of plague too. Why would poisoners kill themselves? Others pointed out the economic disaster that would follow. Jews were essential in finance and trade. To burn them would be to burn the city's own prosperity. But mobs don't listen to logic. Under pressure, the council caved. In January 1349, Basil's entire Jewish community was locked inside a wooden house built on the Rhine. Then, in broad daylight, the structure was set ablaze. Chroniclers claimed as many as 600 men, women, and children were roasted alive while the city watched. Basil's counselors had failed, not because they didn't know better, but because they couldn't withstand the storm of fear and debt resentment that whipped their people into frenzy. Elsewhere, bishops and nobles who tried to shield Jews often found themselves overthrown. In Freiburg and Zurich, protections were overturned by sheer mob violence. In some cases, mayors who resisted were assassinated or chased out of town. The lesson was clear. Stand against the panic, and you fall with it. And so the massacres spread unchecked. But here's the kicker. The evidence that justified all this came from torture, from confessions beaten out of broken bodies. Let's step inside those chambers and see how the myth of poisoned wells was manufactured, one scream at a time. Here's the grotesque secret. The well poisoning conspiracy wasn't discovered. It was invented. Inside dungeons, under iron and flame. Picture a Jewish merchant dragged before a magistrate, accused of sprinkling poison into fountains. He denies it, of course. Who wouldn't? So the guards stretch him on the rack, his joints tearing from their sockets. Hours pass. The questions repeat. Who gave you the poison? Who paid you? Which wells? The pain becomes unbearable. And finally, the answer comes. Whatever the torturer wants to hear. That's how the myth spread. Confessions forged in agony. In Chillon Castle on Lake Geneva, officials recorded detailed testimonies of Jews admitting to smearing powders on door handles, poisoning springs, conspiring with rabbis. Some even claimed they'd been given poison by a shadowy figure called the King of Granada, a Muslim leader Jews had supposedly allied with to destroy Christendom. It was fantasy, stitched together from fear and prejudice, but written down in neat clerical Latin, it became fact. Medieval Europe treated torture as divine revelation. Pain, they thought, stripped away lies. In reality, it manufactured lies so convincing they lived for centuries. Modern ears might scoff, but think about it. How different is this from today's conspiracy theories spread online, repeated until they feel true? Then it was parchment and broken bones. Now it's tweets and doctored videos. The method has changed. The result is the same. And once truth was established, the executions could be justified. But the manner of those executions, public, theatrical, sadistic, turned killing into civic entertainment. Executions weren't hidden behind stone walls. They were staged. They were advertised. They were entertainment. Picture a city square in 1349. The bells toll, crowds gather, and guards drag bound men, women, and even children toward towering pyres of wood. Not criminals, neighbors, entire Jewish communities accused of poisoning the wells. In Basel, Switzerland, the council decreed every Jew, man, woman, and child, be herded onto a specially built wooden house. They locked the doors. Then they set it on fire. The screams echoed for miles. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in a single day. Valentine's Day, no less. Flowers and love for some, flames and death for others. And here's the kicker. The plague hadn't even reached Strasbourg yet. The executions were meticulously organized. Records show town councils scheduling burnings as civic events. Bakers sold bread to spectators. Children climbed onto shoulders for a better view. Some victims sang psalms as the flames took them, their voices blending with the roar of the crowd. It wasn't just about killing. It was about sending a message. The fires purified the community, they said. The ash itself was holy, proof that God's justice had been done. Really, it was mass murder dressed up as divine cleansing. And yet, after the ashes cooled, city leaders collected something else. Canceled debt notes. Conveniently, many victims had lent money to their killers. But even this horror had layers. Because while some councils orchestrated these massacres, others hesitated. And hesitation revealed another kind of terror: betrayal from within. The pogroms weren't always a mob storming the gates. Often, they were decided in hushed council chambers, with ink, not pitchforks. That's what makes them so chilling. These were premeditated massacres, signed off by men in fur-lined robes who called it justice. Take the case of Strasbourg. Council minutes still survive. They show some leaders arguing to protect the Jews, pointing out that if Jews truly poisoned wells, they'd be dead too. But those voices were drowned out. Why? Money. Nobles and burghers owed staggering debts to Jewish lenders. Burning your creditor was cheaper than repayment. And so the vote was cast. The Jews would die. In other towns, rulers who promised protection suddenly vanished when mobs surged. Princes and bishops swore to defend their Jewish subjects, then quietly looked away when the killing began. Some even pocketed the seized property themselves. Imagine being told by the authorities, "Don't worry, you're safe," only to see those same men lighting the torches. The betrayal ran even deeper. In some places, Christians who tried to hide or defend their Jewish neighbors were themselves accused of poisoning plots. Solidarity was criminalized. If you sheltered a Jew, you risked burning beside them. Fear didn't just kill communities. It severed friendships, turned neighbors into executioners. And so the massacres became systemic. Policy. Betrayal sealed the fate of thousands, turning rumor into genocide. But betrayal was only the beginning. Once suspicion became law, the trials began, and the trials were nothing more than theater of agony. Imagine being dragged into a medieval courtroom, not to face justice, but to star in a play whose ending is already written. That was the reality of the so-called well-poisoning trials. They were not courts. They were theaters of agony, staged to validate the massacre that was already scheduled. Accused Jews were paraded before magistrates, their faces swollen from days of torture. The charges? Dropping mysterious powders into wells, conspiring with Satan, even spreading plague through the very air. Evidence? None, unless you count the confessions wrung from dislocated limbs and charred skin. The script was always the same. First, the prisoner denied the accusations. Then came the rack, the screws, the branding irons. After hours or days, they confessed to impossible crimes. Yes, I poisoned the wells. Yes, we plotted with Moors. Yes, we killed children. Each word extracted by fire, then carefully recorded by clerks in immaculate Latin. The crowd saw only the finale. A verdict read aloud, the condemned paraded to the stake. It was civic ritual, like a parade or feast day, except the entertainment ended with human screams. And make no mistake, people cheered. The theater worked, These weren't trials, they were tools. Tools to cleanse a community, to justify theft, to sanctify bloodlust under the guise of law. And once one city staged this grotesque play, others followed. From Mainz to Cologne, the trials spread like plague itself. But there's another twist. Even as the flames rose, not everyone believed the story. Some knew the truth and tried desperately to stop the lie. Amidst the roar of the mobs, there were whispers of reason. A few brave souls dared to say what should have been obvious. Jews weren't poisoning wells. They were dying of plague like everyone else. If they had a secret cure, why would their own children be in the mass graves? One of the most striking voices was Pope Clement VI. From Avignon, he issued a bull in 1348 declaring the accusations baseless. He reminded Christians that plague spread everywhere, even in places with no Jews at all. He even offered papal protection to Jewish communities. On parchment, at least, the Church admitted the truth. But parchment doesn't stop fire. Clement's words couldn't compete with the visceral power of fear. Local priests often fanned the flames instead, preaching that Jews were agents of Satan, spreading pestilence as part of an apocalyptic plot. And when mobs are already sharpening knives, reason is treason. Chroniclers record a few bishops and noblemen who sheltered Jews in castles or monasteries. Some succeeded, briefly. Others saw their fortresses stormed, their wards dragged out and burned while they stood helpless. The lesson was brutal. Doubt was dangerous. To question the hysteria was to invite it onto yourself. And so the voices of reason were drowned out in the roar of the crowd and the crackle of flames. But this wasn't just about fear and faith. Beneath the sermons and smoke lay a more calculating force. Economics, debt, profit. And that's where the story turns truly cynical. Strip away the sermons, the smoke, the hysteria, and what do you find? Money. Cold, hard, medieval money. Jewish communities across the Rhine weren't just neighbors, they were lenders. Because Christian law restricted usury, Jews filled the niche of money lending. Kings, dukes, city councils, all of them borrowed heavily. And by 1349, those debts were crushing. What's easier? Repaying your creditors, or burning them alive and seizing their assets? The pogroms worked like economic resets. In Strasbourg, after the Valentine's Day massacre, the city council simply canceled all outstanding debts owed to Jews. Convenient, isn't it? The flames not only consumed human beings, they erased financial obligations. In Mainz, seized Jewish property was auctioned off to the highest bidder, enriching the very burghers who had demanded the killings. In Basel, confiscated homes were redistributed to loyal citizens as rewards. It was systematic looting disguised as divine punishment. And the victims? They weren't only poor traders. Some Jewish communities were wealthy, integrated, vital to city economies. Their destruction destabilized finance across Europe, but in the short term, their killers got rich. It's darkly familiar. When modern crises hit, scapegoats are often chosen not just out of fear, but for profit. Blame the outsider, seize their assets, declare it justice. The well-poisoning massacres weren't just a moral collapse. They were an economic strategy dressed up as theology. But money couldn't stop the truth. Because after the smoke cleared, the plague still raged. The massacres hadn't saved a single life. The bodies kept piling higher. And that left Europe with a terrifying question. If the Jews weren't to blame, then what was? Picture a town square still blackened from the pyres. The Jews have been purged, their homes looted, their bodies burned. The council congratulates itself. Surely now the plague will vanish. Surely God will spare them. But then the coughing starts again. The swellings return, black buboes, stinking breath, blood coughing from lungs, the same death, spreading through the same streets. Only now there are fewer doctors, fewer moneylenders, fewer neighbors, because they're ash. Chronicles tell us that weeks after the pogroms, plague still roared through Strasbourg, Basel, Mainz, and Cologne. Entire quarters collapsed. Whole families were wiped out. Mass graves overflowed. The killings had achieved nothing. Fear had eaten its victims, and then it ate its executioners. Some noticed the cruel irony. Jewish communities in Poland and parts of Eastern Europe, where pogroms were less severe, often fared no worse, and sometimes better, than their annihilated counterparts. The disease followed trade routes and rats, not bloodlines. The massacres had been useless theater, and yet uselessness didn't stop them. By 1350, entire swaths of Europe's Jewish population had been obliterated. Centuries-old communities erased in less than 2 years. Survivors fled east, carrying with them trauma that would echo across generations. This is the true legacy. Plague did its work, but so did panic. One killed bodies, the other killed societies, and panic proved just as contagious as any flea. But here's the twist. When the bodies were gone, the memory remained. And that memory was weaponized again and again in ways that shaped Europe for centuries.